Hey, I'm Dr. T, and welcome to my living room. Do a little bit more Banished. For those of you who haven't seen the other videos, Banished is a video game. It's about a series of individuals who've been banished from their homeland and have to make a new life in a new community in the wilderness. And today I would like to talk a little bit about one of my somewhat lesser used individuals, and wrong button, and that is my herbalist. So this individual looks like a lady. I'm not entirely sure. The little circle means that I've got plenty of herbs, and I don't know if they actually get used in this game. It's weird. They're supposed to help with ill members of my community. So one thing I wanted to talk about is what these plants would be doing. So my herbalist is looking through my forest. You can see the little circle, the range that I think it's a she has, and looking for flowers and other plants that could be used to make medicinal substances. So that got me thinking, like, hey, some real examples of these and where we have gone with them as a society. Because, of course, before modern pharmaceuticals, this is all you had. Now, the trick with these is that when you have a pharmaceutical, whether it be, a modern pill or it is a dried or fresh plant of some sort or a fungus or whatnot, really what you've got is a chemical that is going to be doing something for you. Typically, these chemicals are going to be interacting with enzymes, typically speaking, inactivating them, making them either not work at all or slowing down their functions, inhibiting them. These are called enzyme inhibitors quite often. And the difference between a pharmaceutical and a poison is basically dose. So, if you can imagine overdosing, well, that's what a poison is. You're overdosing on something. As the saying goes, the dose makes the poison. So a couple of stories on this, because stories are always fun. So one of the plants that she might be looking for is willow. And there's actually a couple of different plants that'll have the same active ingredient, but willow is kind of the most famous. So within the bark of the willow is the salicylic acid. And salicylic acid is an enzyme inhibitor for the COX enzyme. And this is an enzyme that converts arachidonic acid, which is a fatty acid, into prostaglandins. And I say that in plural because there's more than one of them. And these are kind of short-range communicators for cells, and they communicate inflammation. So when cells get prostaglandins, they do things like increase temperature. So this is part of fever's pathway. Increase pain, increase swelling, various other things as they're responding to damage. Now, of course, if you've got the fire alarm and the fire alarm's going off, that's going off for a reason. You need to deal with it. But at a certain point, you just want it to shut up. It's becoming more of a problem than the problem it's trying to alert you of. Or, you've addressed the problem, or you've addressed it as well as possible. So we want the ability to alleviate inflammation. And this leads to a whole class of drugs called non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, or NSAIDs. And salicylic acid is really one of the first ones. But this really highlights a couple of the issues that herbal medicine quite often runs to. So for starters, I don't think there's any actual willows here. Wish there was. Plants or basket or something. But if I had willows, they're not making the salicylic acid for me. Instead, they are making it for their own ends, and therefore the amount of salicylic acid they put in their bark is going to vary wildly. So one willow on one season might have a lot of salicylic acid in its bark, and thus if I'm making a tea from the bark of the willow to treat my fever, then I don't want to use too much. I don't want to brew it too strong, otherwise I could be overdosing. Alternatively, another willow at another time may have very little salicylic acid, and thus I have to make a lot of very strong tea from the bark in order for that to treat my fever. And I don't have a way of knowing. Sometimes you can tell, sometimes there's telltale signs of the plant, and a good herbalist would know, at least to the degree that they could know. But obviously you'd like to be able to control this. A second, just kind of scaling up. My community is fairly small. I've increased it from the earlier videos, so this was kind of the first area. And if you see me rotating, that's because I'm used to the W and E keys being strafe. And they're not strafed in Banished. They're rotate in Banished. I play, other style games a lot. Anyway, so, I've got a small community, but look at all the land. Where if you imagined a large city, there wouldn't be all of this land for the willows to grow. So if you're trying to extract this from willow, this is going to be a fairly major problem. Some plants you can farm, but others you can't, at least not easily. And so what would be great is if you could synthesize the salicylic acid artificially. And so in the 19th century, I want to say it was 19th, we developed a way of synthesizing salicylic acid without the willow. And this allowed for a much larger production of salicylic acid at a lower cost. But there's a second problem with salicylic acid in particular, and it is really hard on your stomach. I mean, it is hard on your stomach, so you do not want to be consuming it on a regular basis. So late 19th century, it was realized, like, hey, we could modify the salicylic acid chemically. Do a small modification, add an acetate group, which is 2 carbons, an oxygen, and 3 hydrogens. Modest change to it. And you could form acetosalicylic acid, which, of course, we all know by the brand name aspirin. So from the herbal remedy, we get understanding of the active ingredient. And from that, we can then produce the active ingredient in ways that are cheaper, more scalable. Ones that you can produce a lot of it for a low cost, and then we can start modifying that. And this is how the path of a lot of pharmacology has gone. Look for a natural substance, one that potentially has been used for millennia, and then see if you can make it cheaper, better, and then in the process also improving dosing and getting a more reliable dose. Now, there are other classic examples. Of course, penicillin, we all know that story. Interesting enough, the interesting part of that story is that it had been used, bread mold, as wound care for millennia. And it was kind of one of those where we didn't look at the herbal remedies that had been used to find it. Now, we have since looked at basically all of the herbal remedies. We've looked at lots of them because it's a great way of, detecting good possible drug targets, things that we should start looking at. A classic case comes from the late 18th century. And in this case, this has this great story. The Scottish doctor, I believe he was Scottish, has a patient, and she has dropsy. I believe now we would call it arrhythmia. So it's her heart is beating too fast. And at the time, he's like, I'm sorry, ma'am, there is absolutely nothing we can do. This is fatal. You need to get your will in order. You probably have 6 months to live. A year later, he runs into the lady, and she's doing great. And what I can only assume is this conversation of like, ma'am, I don't want to be rude, but why aren't you dead? And it turns out that she has been getting herbal remedies from this old wise woman in the community. And so the doctor does the only sensible thing, gets a big old pile of money, goes up to that wise woman and goes, what did you give this woman? Tell me. Here is a pile of money. And she does. And then he works through about the 12 or 24 herbs in her blend and realizes that the active herb is foxglove. Foxglove is this absolutely beautiful flower, gorgeous, and it is also a deadly flower. It has in it, I'm going to butcher the pronunciation of this one, digoxin. And this is a sodium-potassium pump inhibitor. So in your nerves, they work by allowing sodium and potassium to shuffle across the membrane. Well, once it shuffles, they got to reset the thing. So they use energy, and they have these proteins that reshuffle them. And digoxin will prevent it from shuffling back as quickly. Well, the net result is, specifically since this targets the nerves and muscles around the heart, that it takes longer for them to fire. And thus, your heart beats slower. Now, of course, the plant's goal with this is it's a self-defense measure. It's like, don't eat me, I'm packing, kind of thing. So if you were to eat this plant, or if a cow is to eat it, presuming you're not eating random flowers, then you would not feel well and or not survive, and thus the plant persuades you not to eat it. But, once again, the dose makes the poison, so, hey, this is now a treatment, a very, very common, top 200 drugs prescribed annually globally. UN essential medication. But it has a slightly different story to it. See, unlike a lot of pharmaceuticals, it's actually a fairly large molecule, fairly complicated one that would be very hard for us to synthesize. Not impossible, but it would be absolutely a pain, and not worth the effort when these wonderful flowers do it just fine. So, not that much has changed in the last 200 years. And the way digoxin is made nowadays is a farmer grows a field of foxglove, picks and dries the foxglove, ships it to a factory where the digoxin is extracted from the foxglove and put into pills. Yeah, nothing has changed in that particular case. There's been some changes, but it's still being made from the original flower. So definitely an interesting case scenario. Now, I will say one of the reasons you're wanting to do this instead of just munching on some foxglove is, of course, the dosage, because the flowers will vary in dose. So if you extract it from the flower, you can get a better refinement on, how much dose you're really getting. And additionally, you also don't have to worry quite so much about the fraud. The herbal supplement industry is not well regulated at all, whereas the pharmaceutical industry is extremely tightly regulated. And so if you buy a pharmaceutical that's governed as a pharmaceutical, you know exactly what's in there. You buy an herbal supplement, and sadly, there was a report about 5-6 years ago that within the U.S. Commercial herbal supplements, 30% of them didn't actually contain the plant or the plant that was on the label. So it would be, here's echinacea, contains no echinacea, and that's really sad. But, obviously that's a downside of regulation. That's not a downside of herbal medicines per se. But, being able to improve purity and going for similar molecules that work better has definitely been an approach that we have taken throughout history, or at least throughout the last, couple of, really about the last 100 years or so. And thus making, hopefully, life a little bit better. With that said, have a wonderful day. So yeah, I want to jump into my herbalist, which actually, now that I'm watching them, I saw the yellow circle go away a couple times. That suggests people are actually using the herbs, which is nice to know. I was wondering if it was a bugged part of the game.